Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session, which is called What Does the NDIS Mean for Your Career? Now, I'm going to have to apologize in advance. This is going to be a bit of a sonic experiment. My voice is a little bit husky. I've just come back from a Careers Expo in Western Victoria, which is a really beautiful part of the country, but let's just say it's not tropical. So I've got a bit of a cold. Peter here is my backup. So if the voice fails, he'll hit. And if all else fails, we will complete the presentation with interpretive dance. Thank you for your time this morning. This is a live presentation, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. We love being interrupted. Talking to people about careers in the sector is what we do. We really enjoy it. I guess some of the other sessions today will possibly talk more about the vocational ramifications of the NDIS and person-centered approaches generally. What we'll be talking a bit about is some of the business dynamics behind the introduction of the NDIS, what it means for organizations, and how that will impact potentially on your careers. So without further ado, let's go. First of all, let's say, well, okay, how and why are we, credited to talk about this subject? Well, we're Care Careers, and in brief, Care Careers is a online website. It's a career service and a job board for the sector, and it was established by National Disability Services back in January 2010. This was even before the NDIS was it was being talked about at that stage, but not a reality at all. But even at that stage, there was very conscious of an expanding sector. Care Careers looks after community care and aged care roles as well. The aging population meant that the demand for workers was growing, and this has been really rather supercharged by the NDIS. So over the course of our history, we've had something like 8 million individual users who've come to our website, talk to us. We worked with over 1,000 employers, I think 1,140 I've got there, and we've posted over those years over 100,000 job ads. That means they've attracted, getting on for 500,000 job applications. It also means a lot of meetings, which gives me that last statistic where we've calculated we've consumed 7,780 cups of coffee and 28,700 cigarettes. And despite my voice, I've had no cigarettes, so I find this a bit of a worrying statistic for a fairly small team. Point probably just to add here, Care Careers, we're in the business of providing career advice. So if it doesn't need to end today, we are a phone call or an email away. Please feel free to contact us anytime. That's really why we're here. Okay, but we're here to talk about the NDIS. What is the NDIS? Well, let's go back to the beginning. And this news article comes from 2013. And it's kind of interesting to look back from where we are now 5 years hence at the enormous impact that the introduction of the NDIS meant. It was really a culmination of a long campaign, a very ambitious campaign led by every Australian accounts, by disability service providers and people with disability. And its principles of choice and control for people with disability are just really a fantastic ideal. And it's something that everybody's campaigned for, and there was such excitement really when the NDIS was announced. So this talks about Julia Gillard's tears, and at that point, tears were a good thing. And I say that, and it's probably worth mentioning, because when we get to the next slide, which talks about how, I guess, the NDIS is referenced now, these are just some of the headlines that are, you'll catch quite regularly in the media. And there's a bit of a cycle with these things. We are moving from the idealistic launch to the practical implementation. With something on this scale, any sort of change, I guess, brings issues, and something on this scale, there are quite some large issues. And I don't want to diminish those in any way, but there's also a sense in which a story becomes a bad story, and that's kind of where it is with the media a little bit. We're very conscious of this because we talk to people who work within the sector and people who aren't in the sector coming in from the outside, and it's sort of interesting. The conversation has changed a little recently, and we're getting people, when we talk about the NDIS, they're saying, oh, that doesn't work, does it? Oh, you've got problems with that. So we're in the middle of a period of change. Now, I guess, probably 5 years ago when everybody was looking at that, most people would have foreseen there would be issues. Everybody's talked about a transition period. I think at the moment we are slap bang in the middle of the transition period, and that really has implications for organizations and for your roles. So let's talk about some of those. Okay, while I'm doing that, I'm going to say in this middle of transition, part of this and how you deal with it as an individual is how you approach it. And that may be in part about how you see the NDIS. And I've got you know, some fairly, fairly obvious slides here in terms of how people might see it. The previous slide might have suggested it's the one at the top left with the dark clouds. It would suggest it's probably closer to the one at the bottom at the moment, the roller coaster, but we should definitely encourage you to the one on the right, the opportunity, because really, in an expanding sector where new things are happening, that does mean opportunity. Certainly that's in terms of careers, we think there are a lot of opportunities. Yes. We'll talk about some of those. Okay, let's talk about that, let's talk about, sorry, I just looked at my watch, I'm going too fast. We'll talk about why we think it's a positive step. This next slide shows it. When the NDIS was set up, the calculations about how many people it might need to actually deliver it were interesting, and we were involved in them. And at that stage, I guess part of the learning curve was that the statistics, the workforce statistics around our sector were fairly soft. It was hard to tell exactly how many people were working in the sector when the Productivity Commission made the original report that basically became the, I guess, the genesis of the NDIS. But what it foresaw was roughly the number of people who might be served by the NDIS doubling. So in essence, the market, if you like, the number of people with disability who might be receiving services in some format or another would double. And so it was not unrealistic to suggest that the workforce might double at the same time. And the figure that was most commonly used probably was around 70,000 new jobs occurring over that period. But this was forecasting and in the realms of I guess in those not exactly guesswork is probably too strong a word for it, but it was nothing more than forecast. But if you look now in 2018, we can really see that happening. This particular graph is a graph from Seek. I think everybody knows is a very large job board that carries an enormous number of jobs nationally. And this has shown the number of advertisements for roles in the sector since the NDIS was announced. And they're showing a growth at this stage of about 62% over that time. So that really is an enormous number of jobs. And much of the conversation at the moment and the government's agenda is around jobs and growth. An awful lot of the jobs that have been created over the last year actually come from our sector. So it's a huge driver of jobs. And where there are lots of new jobs being created, that certainly must say opportunity. Cough break, excuse me. So what kind of jobs and really are they all the same? What's the story? This is an interesting graph. And this is taken from National Disability Services' own report for collecting data, something called Workforce Wizard, where we question our disability service providers as to how they're hiring and what the trends are. And in this graph, what we've segmented small, medium, and large organizations. What this graph shows is that they're changing in different ways. The blue line at the top is the number of permanent staff. The yellow line in the middle is the number of casual staff. And the red line at the bottom is the number of fixed term or contract staff. I think with the latter one, there was a lot of predictions that would be many more contract roles happening as a result of the NDIS. We haven't seen that as much. It still remains relatively low. What certainly is changing is the proportion of the permanent and the casual roles. And as you can see there, it's very different. With small organizations, the trend, there's been growth with permanent roles, but not as big, whereas casual roles have been outstripping them and growing faster. When you get to the other end of the scale with the large roles, it's almost the reverse of the story. It's the permanent roles that are growing there. So that's one trend showing that that all growth isn't equal. There are many sort of more permanent roles with the larger organizations. Another cough break. Okay, so how are these things changing? Right, they're changing because disability providers are changing. And I've illustrated somebody's reaction here with this cat. There are only two things I don't like: change and the way things are. I think what we're going to try to do with this presentation is to encourage you to forsake your inner cat, let it go. Because there are changes we think brings opportunity. Certainly in terms of the way providers are changing. Well, there have been some really big and prominent amalgamations in the sector. So there's big organizations joining together. And there's a view, and it's probably an economist, and I probably should have researched this before, but a commonly used statement: in times of change, you get big or you get specialized. And organizations have seen this as a way of dealing with the what's a really fundamental change with the NDIS, and perhaps I should dwell a bit about that. The NDIS is built around choice and control. It's around the rights and demands and needs of the individual and their ability to steer what they need from providers. And this is really a total change from the way the sector operated 5 years ago. And really, it's a complete change of the business model. For organizations that used to work in the sector, funding came usually from state governments, but it came reliably at the certain times of the year, and an organization could safely plan ahead based on what their funding income would be and the number of people they were serving, into the new world where funding comes to the individual. And two sort of practical things with that. Well, one very basic one is that the previous block funding came in advance. Funding from individuals comes in arrears, which means that you don't get it until after you've delivered the services, which is had a huge impact on some smaller organizations with, because when you have that sort of change, you need money in the bank, and quite a number of the small ones didn't. There's also the case of unpredictability in that you're getting, instead of all your money or a large proportion of your money coming from one large block provider, you're getting it from lots of different individuals. That necessarily means it's much harder to predict. So organizations had to change in many ways to basically deal with that change. And some of the ways they did it were amalgamations, as I was saying earlier, just becoming a bigger organization, hoping that would make them more resilient in that form of change. There's also an element of spreading the business that we've seen disability organizations, you might give some practical examples who changed their names, and partly they're moving outside disability.
We'd have, I suppose, Challenge Disability Services historically have changed their name to Challenge Community Services because they see themselves having a wider offer than just disability. We have some organisations dropping, again, maybe community or disability out of their titles, again, just selling a wider, a series of offerings. And yeah, people are a lot more brand conscious. Yeah, going to market, offering the services. We found that there are much more markedly communications and marketing engaged in the online space. So that's been a huge change for us.
So really an awful lot of change. And contrary to this grumpy cat, I would suggest that if your organization, if your employer is not changing, that's when you need to worry. This really is some people will find this unsettling. We're all in this together. We're right in the middle of a huge period of change, but organizations are learning how to work in a new way. And back to my roller coaster earlier, you've got to kind of stay in there white-knuckled, and we'll tell you a little bit why as we move on. But it's this is a time of change. Just be aware of that, and there will be more change. There are also a lot of new entrants in the disability market. Now, market's probably not a word we would have used 5 years ago, but that we commonly talk about the disability sector. But there are lots of new organizations entering. Just incidentally, one of those kind of death and doom headlines I showed you earlier talked about the number of organizations deregistering. I don't think that's quite as threatening or worrying as the article writer might have wanted to make out. We noticed, because we were working with the NDIS at the time, there was a huge number of organizations who registered to become providers, and some very unusual organizations in the mix, basically. And in the nicest possible way. There's a bunch of chances in there, really. And so I think some of those people have probably found, 3, 4, 5 years later that they simply don't have what it takes to provide this market, so they've quietly dropped out. But them aside, there are some really interesting organizations that have joined too. I've just taken a few examples here. Wild Rumpus is actually an organization we work with. They're based in Geelong, and we work with them with our Project Able initiative, which, if you're not familiar with it, we have groups of presenters with lived experience of disability who go out into schools, and we have a half-day program in which they talk about their disabilities, talk about disability generally, and talk about careers in the sector. Absolutely great fun. If they ever come to your area, get your organization involved. It's a real high-energy presentation, a really interesting impact. We talk to students from years 10, 11, and 12, and also to TAFE students. We're particularly busy in Victoria at the moment. And I guess it's really interesting to see those young people come in. It's a great age to work with, because the reactions you get from teenagers are really unfiltered. It's, what's happening for them, you really get. And often for the students coming in, they'll talk about their reservations as they come in, and often they're just not confident about it, simply interacting, talking with a person with disability. And the moment of magic can be for them just talking with one of our presenters and realizing they can do it. Perhaps the presenter shares some of their interests. It's a lovely program. We're very proud of it. We work in regions with organizations, and this is where Wild Rumpus comes in. What you've got there is the front page of their website, and they kind of don't look like your average disability organization, do they? What they do is they provide a range of supports and options for young people with disability, and they have the emphasis on skill development and social opportunities, and they do it with a huge smile. They are great fun to work with, and just a really interesting kind of take on their customers. Interesting customers is another word that I remember when I joined NDIS, we weren't sure about customers at all. We talked about clients and various other things, but really in the new world, it is customers. A couple more organizations on the left. Many of you might be familiar with Higher Up. Higher Up's interesting. It was born out of a family with a sibling with disability, and what they saw as the shortcomings of the particular providers they work with. And what they've set up is, in essence, an online support organization. So what they do is really provide backup for one-on-one basically arrangements between workers and participants. So it's interesting. They, in many cases, they're sort of formalizing and providing like a safety net for the worker and for the participant working in those circumstances. Interesting, growing fast, and they're an option for support workers coming in directly. In terms of long-term career development, I'm not really sure how those platforms work. It may be one of those things that you do for a period and then you move on, but it is just an interesting approach and a sign of a changing sector. As is Hit 100, which is the third of the organizations. I've just highlighted these ones. What these guys do is NDIS food delivery, and it's really interesting. It's kind of like, Uber Eats for people with disability, but it's not really. It's the very strictly controlled. You start off with interviewing with a dietitian, and you work out what will be suitable for you, and they arrange the rest and your relationship with the NDIS. So it's an example of a small organization prizing off part of what a large organization might do, specializing it, and that's right, doing it well. And we can expect an awful lot more of those organizations. I remember when we were in the sort of implementation phases of the NDIS, the conversations around who these organizations might be. But we've certainly already talked to lots, physiotherapists who specialize in sports programs for people with disability. I remember the example we used, I'm not sure we've seen yet, it was the organization that took people with disability fishing. Why not? Absolutely. And it could be that, that's the specialized market. We'll expect to see an awful lot more of those. So lots of new employers. Water break, excuse me, right. I think you can probably see a small bit of us in the corner of your screen. Probably that's as much as you want to see, actually, about my condition, frankly. But anyway, moving on. So new employers. Technology is also changing the sector. I rather like this photo. I've used it a lot of it's a Japanese care robot, I think. And I'm not really sure this is how technology is changing the sector. I think the poor woman in the wheelchair was completely terrified. But it's more illustrative of, I guess, some of the changes. There have been an awful lot of stories in the media over the last 6 months to a year about how robots are going to steal our jobs. And I don't know about that one. I think the jury's out on that one. I saw a kind of behind the scenes in Silicon Valley, and one of the companies Uber, and yes, they definitely are. I think certainly they will bring change, and automation is possible in a large part. As I say, I'm not sure about care robots, but in smaller ways, technology, software, things that improve efficiency will become more and more part of your world. At its most basic, for many support workers, I guess it's been an interesting challenge in some cases for mature age support workers to get used to the idea of putting in their rosters on an iPad. But that's, I guess, just the tip of the iceberg, potentially what the system might do. Certainly in our sector, and particularly in aged care as well, they're talking about using all forms of technology for monitoring. So you get kind of, wearable clothes that monitor your condition, all sorts of things that might feed back into the services provided. And I wouldn't make too many wild predictions in those areas, but you imagine, as in many other sectors, that the cost of this continually falling down, coming down, and then providing alternatives for aspects of the service they provide. Excuse me. Also in the area of technology, I remember seeing, I think the figure, I got to, if anybody's got the right figure, please contradict me, but of something like 20,000 apps that are being designed for the Apple Store specifically for people with disability. And I think that's really fascinating. It's a great liberator. When we're talking to the school children, I mentioned earlier at those Project Able workshops, when they come in, one of the things is I'm interested in IT, what do I do? You've got this fantastic market out here of so many different groups and needs within the disability sector. And some of the people with disability are fantastic adopters. They love this stuff. And it just gives them, it can open so many doors. So we expect to see more of those sorts of changes coming in. And also seeing some of the big providers, in fairness to them, taking this stuff on board. So Microsoft and Apple particularly have been quite forward-looking, I think, in some areas, in terms of considering an audience with disability. Probably that's due to, I guess, activism by people with disability, but it's certainly a lot of change, and again, once again, expect more. Okay, let's move on. So we've talked about new organizations, new technology. Let's also talk about new roles. We picked out the roles that appear here as job titles that appear on our job board that have come in the last year or so that we just never would have seen 5 years ago. And so we've got account managers, quite a number of titles with business in. Business was a sort of smaller, or the preserve of a lucky few before. It's much more of a prevalent word these days. Customer, again, customer insights manager. I'm not sure we even had customers 5 years ago, but now it's seen as a very important strand. Marketing and communication managers, social media coordinator. I think that's really interesting. We had one role was advertised in Western Sydney, which I thought was really interesting. And in that particular case, it was the mother of a boy with disability looking for a combined social media monitor and support worker. And he had mobility issues, but is this incredibly social boy. And she saw the social media being a fantastic outlet for him, but she was at the same time nervous because of some of the horrible things that can happen at social media at the same time. So the role she designed was somebody who would be his support worker, but also effectively keep him safe and steer in the right direction. And I guess to some extent manage those conversations. It's a fantastic idea. So she single-handedly invented a new role that we perhaps will see more of in years to come. But I think there's going to be roles will change, and the whole kind of element of customer service is strong. It's a pretty strong theme through all of these, I would suggest. And in terms of what you're doing, if you're looking to advance your career, it's a strand. Customer service marketing is certainly one to look at, because that is where many of the opportunities may be. And I'll move that on to the next slide just to illustrate that. An aspect of this we're seeing particularly is more competition for good stuff. Now, there's two things around this. Firstly, say to you as an individual, if you're good at what you do, you have to think of yourself as you're in essence, you're a commodity in a market, but you're in a very valuable position to be, because the market is expanding rapidly. There are an awful lot more opportunities out there. Organizations need good staff. The evidence of what we're seeing here, some of these examples I've shown you here are taken from our job board. And this is organizations realizing that not only do they have to market and to capture their customers, they also need to work harder to capture their staff. We talk about this on the general phrase of employer branding. All of these templates shown here that appear on job ads give you a sense of what the organization is about. And organizations really need to work harder, because you guys are in a strong position. Basically you are desirable. So these organizations need to prove to you that they have what it takes to forward your career. So that's a good position to be in. Generally, this sort of theming is very important for organizations. Really have to think about what they do and how they work, and feed that into the messaging that goes out that you just wouldn't have seen a few years ago. When we started, there were very much sort of announcement ads appeared on Care Careers. Just this is what you need to do. That's it, flat. Nowadays, you're seeing more and more of these sorts of ads, which are beautifully written and really give you a sense of what the organization is about. And having read some of these, you'll read it and think, well, okay, that's the kind of organization I would like to work with. And that's because they need to. They have to compete for you.
Just selling that career home much more strongly now.
Yeah.
And much more aware of their branding. And, they really do chase potential staff and selling those benefits, those career home options and the rest. And that's been a big change. Yeah. It really has.
Peter's Irish, by the way. Did we say that? Did we say that?
I don't know. What did he say?
Yeah, we because this live, there are no subtitles, but we can find it afterwards if you like. Excuse me. Right. Okay, let's move on. I suspect I'm not going to last the whole hour. I'll probably be talking too quickly, so bear with me. And again, if you have questions, fire away. Much of the theme today has really been about change. So my last slide I put up was to get some inspiration on change. And when you look up the inspirational quotes on the web, you get thousands of them. So I'm trying to narrow it down a little bit. I thought, let's look at quotes from the president. So I've got some presidential quotes here from John F. Kennedy. Change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future, which is, yeah, again, that's I think what we're trying to do to you is hopefully imbue with the sense of change is exciting and will bring you, it's worthwhile, it brings opportunities. I love Barack Obama's, change won't come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We're the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. A really fantastic visionary man. And lastly, I know words, I have the best words. Well, that's good, probably. Probably right that the president should. Okay. Excuse me. My voice has got us thus far.
You've done very well.
Thank you. What have I missed, Pete?
I'm not quite sure, Mike. I think one observation with the roles was just a lot more of those roles are actually externally focused rather than within the organization. So that brand management, that going after customers, that projection of them as a good source or solution for those needs that you have, then communicating that message. So that social media, communications, marketing space has really, really grown. And the decision makers in that space are certainly taking the lead in who they're partnering with out there as well. And really, again, that we didn't have those type of brand manager engagements, before maybe 3 years ago. And it's really important now because you said, I think that block funding arrangement where you really could lay out the year ahead and where you got that money in advance to now being in arrears. And there could be a 2 or 3 month period to cover for those unforeseen revenues, and maybe they're not there. So there's a lot of fear, and I think with us on the business side, we just find that you know, they're watching their dollar. They've got to get value because they're reporting back up the line as well.
Yeah.
And I think one role that was there as well, that quality assurance, and that really is that commercial sector type of vibe that's coming into previously not-for-profit type of organizations that didn't have that profit motive. And that's probably the biggest change all around. So it is.
Yeah, I think generally organizations have probably become more rounded in the sense of the you'd find new departments and new dimensions to what they do. And but we've talked to with Care Careers a lot of career changes. We've seen some real, great professionals come from the outside sector who interested in taking on our market and seeing it as an interesting opportunity and bringing some great marketing to the sector that might previously have been deployed on fast-moving consumer goods or some other corporate responsibility. But some really good people who come in, and they made a change and a difference. So it is some organisations are leaner and meaner, but they are generally the standards have been lifted, and I think you'll generally see some really fantastic marketing and image building, indeed media, social building, all those sort of things that just simply weren't there previously. So for you in the sector, I guess, and if you're certainly moving towards upper management, you'll be involved in more areas with a wider range of skills, but I think you'll find that interesting at the same time. Again, changes, opportunity.
Yeah, learning. Yeah.
Okay, I have one last slide, which is our, thank you, which is our contact details. And please, these details say we work 9 to 5 Eastern Standard Time, and these numbers here are for really, we love talking to people in the sector. All right, okay, let's do that. Just been told there's a question, sorry. Where does that go? Oh, sorry, okay, right, fair enough, okay. Forgive me, here we are talking about technical change. I'm not necessarily providing the best example, and as I say to my son, do what I say, not what I do. But the contact numbers here, feel free to use us. We are a service for people who are in the sector and outside, and if you simply want to know what's going on in your area, give us a call. One of the things about those very large numbers of advertisements I was talking about earlier, we have a good sense of what's happening in different parts of the country with different organizations. So if you're looking long term and wondering where those opportunities might be, we can probably point you towards the organizations. Okay, enough from me already, so to the chat. Okay, how does that work? All right, okay. So I think we're going to finish up formally and move to the chat session. Thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate it from Peter and I. And
Thank you.
If you go to the chat room, okay, sorry. It's the chat function on the side. You can tell I rehearse. The chat function on the side if you'd like to talk to us now or use these numbers for after. Thank you very much indeed.
Very much.
Thank you.